Hi, beautiful people. Today we are going to have a somber conversation, but it is a wildly important one. And I am so honored to bring the guest that we have today. You are going to hear from Teng. She is an embodiment coach who works in the intersections of spirituality and sexuality. Tara helps people find their way back to their bodies, overcome shame, and dismantle purity culture in a way that is in alignment with their values and beliefs so they can build a healthy sexual ethic and thrive in freedom and wholeness. Hi, Tara.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I think we are all really overwhelmed by the news. Today, we are specifically talking about the murders of 8 Asian women at
hmm
the massage parlors in Atlanta.
hmm
And actually haven't been updated recently. It is 8 women that are dead.
hmm
Is that correct?
Um, I think it was 7 women, and there were a couple of people of other ethnicities that were caught in the crossfire as well.
Okay, gotcha.
Yes.
But obviously, we all know from the reporting that the target
hmm
was the
The
women working
target
at the
was
massage parlors.
the target was women working. Yes. And from my understanding, it's not clear, and I honestly don't think it matters whether this was a massage parlor that was offering sex work or if it was simply a spa. I don't think it matters because what happened regardless was atrocious. And what happened to these women and everyone that was caught in the crossfire here should never, ever, ever have happened.
Of course, absolutely. And at the same time, I know that it's so important to actually highlight that reality because I know that it's not confirmed, even though
Mm,
I think I've seen the Yelp reviews that do
mm,
heavily imply that a lot of
yes.
white church-going men were reviewing the sort of happy endings they were getting at these particular parlors. So it's like,
Yes.
we don't know it's factual yet or not, but we do have that as,
hmm
evidence that, could prove to be substantial. But I
hmm
know the topic is substantial because I've had a lot of conversations recently in my private life about the treatment of sex workers and
hmm
how stigmatized it's been. And even watching a program, I think I was watching like a Dateline or something like that from
hmm
maybe 5, 6 years ago.
mm
And they referred to someone as just a prostitute,
Mm.
just a runaway. And that was so
Mm.
telling. I know. And it harkens back to my whole childhood. Like I remember so vividly women or people in the sex industry being classified as other, as less
hmm
than, and
hmm
that word
hmm
just.
hmm
And even the reframing of the word from prostitute to
hmm
sex worker obviously is something that sex workers and their allies like us are advocating for, because
hmm
that again shows that this is legitimate work and these people deserve to be protected as much as anyone else is.
Right.
And obviously that's a very nuanced conversation.
Absolutely.
I'll give a trigger warning right off the top too. Like I want to have a no holds barred conversation here. So we
hmm
are going to be addressing all the different elements and nuance. It's going to be about violence. It's going to be about sex work and assault and trauma. So just a heads up for all of that. And Tara, would you mind telling us, because you really blew my mind just learning more about you, exactly
mm
and precisely how you are at the intersection of everything that is important
hmm
in this conversation at the same dang time?
And I know, all in what wrapped up in one person. So I'm a biracial Asian woman. My father was born and raised in Singapore. My grandfather fled China. So I'm first generation on my dad's side. Um, I spent the last 10 years working with sexually exploited women, with women in the sex trade, all across Southeast Asia, all across Canada. I worked in Parliament Hill. I helped amend the criminal code twice to protect victims of sexual exploitation here in Canada. I was named Canada's Woman of the Year. I have a medal from Queen Elizabeth for my human rights work, because this
Girl.
is what I have worked on for so long, protecting vulnerable women and children and gender minorities and racial minorities, from gender-based violence, from sexual exploitation, from trafficking, from male-dominated violence most of the time, quite honestly, if we're going to call a spade a spade. I'm also the daughter of a Southern Baptist pastor and a
Can't believe
survivor of purity culture. And
Woo!
so when we are talking about all the contributing factors that are swirling around this particular issue, I am right in the middle of it. And now I work full-time as an embodiment coach. So like you said, I help people come back to our bodies, to reclaim the fullness of our humanity in a way that looks at our dignity and our wholeness and the liberation of every part of who we are. And we can't have that conversation about liberation until we talk about the injustice and the body-based oppression that we live in, that are the barriers for us to access embodiment. And right now, at the forefront of our conversation is the way that we discriminate, the terrorism, the prejudice, the racism, the violence that is wielded upon people solely because of the way that their bodies look, and the social hierarchy that we place people in because of their bodies. And so that's the conversation that we're going to dive deeper in today. And I want to, if I can ask anything, I know that there's going to be so many people who are going to be listening to it, and we all come from so many different intersections. And I just ask that you lay your guard down. Can we lay our defenses down and see one another in our humanity? I want us to take our team jerseys off, because it's not about that. I don't care about left versus right. I don't care about your political ideologies or your leanings. Like, there's space for us to have that nuanced conversation. But in order for us to do that, we need to see one another in our humanity.
Thank you. Very, very beautiful. And that's the entire spirit of God is Gray, and all I care about building in this space. And that's so much of what I see, this digging in of people's heels, this determination to remain ignorant. I don't need you to answer why that is existing within people, but do you have a theory as to why it's triggering for people or incomprehensible for people? What makes people not want to have this conversation so desperately?
Yeah, because we all want to see ourselves as good people. Right? I mean, even when you hear the way that people and the family of this shooter, this murderer, described him and the family, that they're good Christian people. That's what I heard people describing them as, good Christian people, because we all want to see ourselves as that. We don't want to see ourselves as perpetuating racism. We don't want to see ourselves as perpetuating misogyny. We don't want to see ourselves, and you can go down the line, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all of it, because every injustice that we face in the world starts with the body. Every single one starts with the body. This is why the intersections of embodiment and justice cannot be ignored. And so we don't want to see ourselves that way. I mean, I remember this time, well, not quite this time last year, we've been having this conversation, let's be honest, collectively for generations. But after the murder of George Floyd, we were having a lot of conversations, most of us, hopefully, in our world about racism and the way that we perpetuate these things. And I remember on numerous occasions, I was having conversations with people very close to me, like in my family, in my friend circle, people that I didn't think we had to debate racism over, quite honestly. And they got very heated. I remember one of them standing up and walking away from the table that we were both sitting at and saying, "I'm not racist. Are you calling me racist?" And I said, "I'm saying we're all racist because we have grown up in a system that was built on racism. This is an undeniable fact. There was a time when we had to say that, women were considered persons, for example. We had to go all the way back to Britain to say, because Canada said no at one point in time. We had to go all the way back to Britain to say women are persons. Like, this is the structure that we live in. Racism is no exception. Misogyny is no exception. So we have all grown up in a culture where racism and misogyny and all these other things are swirling around. And it's kind of like asking a frog asking a fish to say, what is water? Like, we don't even know, we can't even recognize it. It's so normalized. It's in the air that we breathe. It's the water that we are swimming in, right? So of course, when we have grown up in that kind of environment, even if you are a good Christian person, even if you're just a good person, or you want to see yourself as a good person, you aim to be a good person, we all have to do this inner work of dismantling these things that we have absorbed from our culture. And that's where the conversation has to start. If we're starting with a place of like, hey, Asian women were just shot, targeted, and killed because of the fetishization of Asian women, which is the intersections of racism and misogyny, you can't sit there and say, well, no, racism wasn't a factor. You can't sit there and say these things weren't a factor. I'm not racist. Things don't exist. If you're starting the conversation like that, then we're never going to move forward. We're never going to get anywhere, because we have to sit there and say, okay, where do I need to dismantle these things within me?
Mm-hmm.
That's where we start. Where do I need to start dismantling these things within me? Where have I centered whiteness? Where have I centered normativity? Where have I centered myself to the expense of other people? That other people's lives are being treated as disposable to uphold the system of hierarchy, of patriarchy, of dominance, of power and control. Because that's really the conversation that we're having right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel when I was asleep, this is why I actually love the terminology of wokeness, because I know
Right.
it's become this like liberal,
Mm.
demonized terminology. But I'm like, no, when I was asleep, I used to say, I just want a world where I can't see color. I used to say I
Right.
can't see color. And I know that we as white people will see that as a really generous thing. Like, hey, we just
Mm.
don't want you to be treated any differently. But what
Mm-hmm.
people don't understand is that we have planted trees that have
Mm.
root rot. These seeds are rotten. So any fruit that is growing off these trees, you can find one good apple,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have a shooting like this, and you're like, oh, look,
Mm-hmm.
rotted fruit. That thing needs to be completely torn up and
Mm-hmm.
looked at, and something brand new needs to be planted in its place.
Yes.
And also for anyone that's in denial, I'm like, okay, name me 9 movies where an Asian woman was the lead in the movie and it wasn't a thing that she was Asian. Like, there's no
Right.
such thing. We don't live in a post-racial society at all. And you can see it in Hollywood, you can see it in politics. Name
Mm-hmm.
one Asian president. It's just like,
Right.
and these things too are also recent history.
Yes.
There are pictures of Black people needing to use different water fountains. That
Mm-hmm.
is not long ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we've only had a Black president very, very recently.
Right.
And then the Asian internment camps. Do you know
Right.
what year that was? That was recent as hell.
Yeah. My ex-husband, I'm now a single mom, but my ex-husband, his family was sent to the Japanese internment camps. So they
Wow.
are my family because I married into that family. It's that recent. It's my and my own grandmother, she was a child in Singapore during World War II. She remembers cutting her hair short, binding her chest because soldiers would come and they would rape young girls. She remembers being pulled out of school because boys got to go to school and girls did not.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
even as recent as a couple days ago, she was telling us, and I love her dearly, and she's just a wonderful, strong, resilient woman, was perpetuating the misogyny and saying that, like, the man is the head of the house, and so he must eat before everybody else, because these are these structural cultural things. And so this is what I'm saying, whereas, like, yes, my own grandmother is a wonderful person, and yet still has absorbed some of these ideas of patriarchy and misogyny and control.
Yeah, there you go. And that's a beautiful example. Like, we wouldn't point a finger and call her a misogynist, but you
Right.
would point and be like, okay, this is an example of how
Yes.
ingrained misogyny is.
But this idea that you
Yeah.
are perpetuating and upholding is misogynist,
Yeah.
right? And in the last couple of days, I and many other good friends of mine in the Asian American community have been speaking out about anti-Asian racism. We've been speaking out about hate crimes. We've been sharing our experiences as Asian women who have faced and dealt with fetishization our whole entire lives. And not only have we been met with intimidation, not only have we been met with complete and total dismissal, we've been met with complete and total gaslighting. You know, we've had people come up to us saying that they are good people and that this just doesn't exist. This just doesn't exist. We're just wrong. It's so much to the point that people have gotten aggressive towards us. We have received hate mail, and we're literally sitting there saying, like, you are proving our point.
Yeah.
You're proving our point. We are speaking up and saying that, like, this is a problem. I'm sharing with you real life stories as well as statistics, like lived evidence and statistic to explain why this is a problem. And you are doubling down in your behavior and then coming at us aggressively with intimidation, with gaslighting, which is a perpetuation of this injustice and oppression. And then actually going to the point of threatening violence to us for speaking out against the violence. Do you not see that this is a problem?
Okay. Again, just I sometimes laugh so I don't cry. It's absurd.
Right.
Okay.
No, I was just gonna say, and this is the thing, right? You know, I've had people tell me that they don't see Asian women as women of color or people of color, right? Because, and this is why, in one sense, I was speaking with my best friend last night, who is also an Asian woman, and she was saying, I'm so glad we're having this conversation because we've been silent for too long. And I hate that it has had to come to this. I hate that it is that these women have had to suffer, who have had their lives stolen from them. Our siblings, our Asian siblings, have had their lives stolen from them at the hands of a hateful person who saw them as the target. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more about why this even happened, because I think these contributing factors are so incredibly important. But for many of us, people are saying, we're glad that we're actually at least finally having this conversation, because Asians have been treated as the model minority for so long, which is quite honestly a myth, right? You bring us in, and it was politically strategized to see Asian people as less threatening, because you then benefited off of our exploitation and our cheap labor. You needed to put our bodies in the line of violence so that you didn't have to do that, which is why we built the railroad. We did all these things. We took the jobs that nobody else wanted because they were dirty and they were dangerous. We put our bodies in the line of danger historically. And you did this in a way that, oh, we're not as threatening as other racial groups, right? So we benefit, in a sense, from our proximity to whiteness, but we're not treated as equal. We're treated as disposable. We're treated as cheap labor. We're treated as playthings. And it's this complex place because for many of us who are the children of immigrants or the children of refugees, because there are a lot of Asian people in North America who are refugees, and we come here wanting to have a better life, often fleeing situations other places in the world where the United States has gone into countries we have had to flee as refugees. We come here now seeking a better life, leaving a situation that was perpetuated from the United States, quite ironically. And the reason why you have a lot of Asian parents pushing children to become professionals, right? They push us to be high achievers. They push us to be doctors, lawyers, to be as high as we can, to hope that we will no longer be in the line of violence. That's why our parents do this. They push us to be overachievers. They push us to be doctors. They push us to be lawyers. They push us to be pharmacists. It's become a trope now at this point. And it's so that maybe you will see us as human now. Maybe you will see us as not threatening. And yet, unfortunately, the experience as an Asian woman is that it's very hard to be seen not as some sex object, not as some plaything. We're always treated as that. Asian women are the most fetishized and sexually exploited people group on the planet. Fact.
Really?
Facts. We are the most trafficked people group on the planet.
Really?
We're the most fetishized people group on the planet. I think people forget how big Asia is as well too, and how diverse is. And again, this feeds into the racism and the stereotype. We have deep, beautiful, rich, diverse cultures, We're not all just one. It's not Pan-Asia. We're not all the same, but this is why representation is so important. This is why when we say representation matters and these stereotypes do harm, is because you're feeding into these Orientalist tropes, and you're not really seeing me in the fullness of my humanity, because you see me just as like the nerdy Asian or the hot Asian girl, and then either way, you're just objectifying me.
100%. Yes.
Right. And that in this conversation that we're talking about with the fallout from the shooting that recently happened in Atlanta, the shooting spree, we have to have that conversation about the fetishization of Asian women as a contributing factor. And we have to talk about the fact that for both of us, and for me especially, as also the daughter of a Baptist pastor, and the shooter was the son of a Baptist pastor, this is violence on my own community, but that is also perpetuated by my own community.
Okay, yes. So let's tackle this beast from all of the angles that I see applicable. Because we have purity culture, fetishization, sex work. What else am I forgetting? Obviously, racism,
classism, white nationalism, white terrorism.
Yes. Okay.
Take your pick.
I know. What a fun little bag. Oh my gosh. What a nightmare bag. Okay. So I definitely started the conversation on God is Gray from the angle of purity culture.
Yeah.
And then I had a couple slides that are like, you're doing this wrong. You're centering yourself in the story. But anyway, I did feel bad, but at the same time, I was like, well, I can only speak from this one angle, really. And that's misogyny, patriarchal church values. And that ridiculous police chief who made that statement.
Oh yeah,
he had a bad day. He had a bad day. I can't even.
When I have a bad day, I have a bath.
Yeah.
Right.
I ate a pizza.
Right. And so like maybe this is a great opportunity to talk about how we talk about men managing their emotions. Like all of these layers.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Right? Yeah. All of these layers. Let's teach proper skills of emotional maturity. And again, as an embodiment coach, and this is the way that I view my lens, is like, you have been taught that your emotions are too much. Men and women and everybody in between on the spectrum, right? Men have been taught that it's weak to show their emotions. It's too feminine to show their emotions, which again feeds into the misogyny, because anything feminine is emasculating to a man, even though men have masculinity, women have masculinity, men have femininity, women have femininity, and everybody in between. And so we have demonized emotions and taught men that they need to shut it down, be a man, don't cry, which I think is wildly inappropriate. And also even the data goes back and says that like men actually die earlier than women, because one of the contributing factors is because they don't cry. Because crying is a detox for your body. And if you don't do that, your body isn't able to release. Expressing your human emotions is part of your humanity. It is part of being embodied. It is part of the full expression of who you are. When we shut that down for people, it has devastating effects. It is deadly to ourselves. It is deadly to others, as we are witnessing right now. So men have been taught to shut down their emotions because it is feminine, and that's misogyny. Women have been taught to shut down their emotions because then they're crazy and we're hysterical, and which is also misogyny. And quite honestly, women have been institutionalized for that in the past. So we fear that. So we learn as well to shut down and suppress our emotions out of an act of survival, because we still have that. We know that the new science is showing us that these things, trauma is passed down intergenerationally through the body. And so ingrained in our DNA are these patterns of survival where men have been taught to shut down their emotions, women have been taught to shut down their emotions, and then we're all dying and we're killing each other as a result.
I know. You're hitting so many nails on the head, 100%. And it's really, I was going to say, it's really striking that the whole argument is like, this was a good Christian boy. He was a good Christian boy.
He just had a bad day.
I was looking every time I drive by like a church because they have outdoor
Mm,
services now and I hear worship songs that I used to hear. I'm doing so much inner work I've already forgiven. I've definitely moved
mm,
out of the like rage and hate phase.
right.
I'm definitely, still holding people's feet to the fire, still holding
Yeah.
problematic values accountable, but I don't have that like rage that I used to.
Right.
But when I drive by a church, I was just noticing in my body, because I'm obsessed with the practice of embodiment and I
Yes.
love to talk to you
Same.
about it more. But just noticing that all my, I just like clam up like this in my car and like turn up
Mm-hmm.
the music so it's louder.
Trauma.
Yeah. And I was like, babe, like, wow, notice this about yourself. Like, what's going on, girl? Like, with my
Right.
body. And I was like, you know what, though? That's justified because I know people are getting hurt in there, that
Yes.
is an unsafe space for people's
Yes.
body. And I worry for them. I get scared. It's like seeing
Yes.
something traumatic happening to other people. And maybe that's presupposing a lot of things, but like that's just my experience.
Mm-hmm.
That said, when we have this whole argument of good Christian boy,
Mm.
in my body, in my experience, I'm like, yeah, that could be a very dangerous person.
It's true.
So, can we unpack why being a good Christian boy in the Baptist church is actually a detriment to society?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. And I don't want to say I don't want to say white men. See, here's the thing. My brain and my body are conflicting right now because my brain wants to say white men aren't dangerous. And I believe that they're not inherently dangerous. But my body goes, "Girl, run. Girl, run. Run."
Well, I saw a
Right?
TikTok that the girl was like she was just saying like we're saying not all men, like men are
Yeah.
attacking and being like not all men, not all men, but it's like but we don't know which man is
Yeah.
dangerous until the dangerous thing happens.
Yeah.
So you kind of do just have to have this awareness at all
Yeah.
times, and that's not expecting the worst of people, but that just is like
The rape statistic is 97% in North America. The rape statistic is 1 in 3 in Canada. 1 in
wait,
3 women.
97%
Right.
of people will be raped?
97% of women have experienced this. Sexual assault.
97%.
Right. In
Sorry,
Canada,
you're blowing my mind.
the statistic is 1 in 3.
I mean, I know from talking to friends that percentage works out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is exactly the point. When I have a conversation with my friends, almost every single one, no, not even almost, every single woman that I speak to either has been a victim of sexual assault or knows a victim of sexual assault. But the wild thing is that men know nobody. Men have never known a single other man who has perpetuated sexual violence on another single human being. None
Oh,
of them.
oh, yeah.
Right. Right. So this is what I
Yeah.
mean. This is the hard conversations that we have to have. It is hard. It is uncomfortable. We said that at the beginning of the discussion. That's why I'm asking you to lay your defenses down. It is hard
Yeah.
because we then have to do that internal reflection to go, oh shit, where have I done harm?
And I'll answer that too from my perspective because something I've loved learning about is men's sexuality. And
Yeah.
Peggy Orenstein's book, Men and Sex, is incredible, or Boys and Sex, rather, is incredible. She interviews like hundreds of prepubescent adolescent boys. And one thing is that men don't always want to have sex, but we as women have been conditioned and men have been conditioned with this false narrative. Guys just want to bang. Like they could come home from their mom's funeral and they'll still be down if you just like touch their crotch.
They're just randy all the time. They can't help themselves.
They can't help themselves.
It's so untrue on so many levels. And I want to take a minute to explore this for a second. Because again, yes, I grew up in the church. I grew up in the Baptist church. I grew up in purity culture. I'm the daughter of a Baptist pastor. So like I grew up my whole life hearing people say like, men are the head. Men are the head of the home. They are the leaders. They are ordained by God to be the leaders. And they are in control of everything except their own sexual urges.
Oh, Oh,
Make it make sense.
oh
I'm
my
sorry.
girl.
Make it make sense, because
Yes.
it does not make sense. It does not make sense. When I was newlywed, I went to a Bible study where these older, not older, but like women who had been married for 10, 15, 20 years were mentoring young women in their marriages, right? And they just wanted to support us. We had like little babies and we were newlywed, and you know, all the things that you would expect from a typical church culture, church community in this kind of space. And literally, we sat on the couch and one of them told me, sometimes, you know, he's tired, he comes home from work, you just, even if you're not feeling it, you just got to like take one for the team. And I'm looking at her like, excuse me, just let him penetrate my body and just take one for the team, because men have needs.
I mean,
No,
for anyone
no.
listening too, that is not uncommon.
No,
That
it's
is the
mainstream.
normal mainstream script in
It's like
church
literally preached from the pulpit on Sunday morning. This is mainstream.
currently.
Mainstream. I even this morning was listening to a pastor preaching over Zoom on their church, and saying they're preaching out of Ephesians 5. And again, this is the first Sunday after the Atlanta shooting. This was to an Asian American church. This pastor did not address for 1 second the Asian women who were slain. Did not address for 1 second, but took the time to say women have to submit to their husbands, and men, you ought to love your wives as you love your own body, and said that men had to sacrifice. So when they come home, you got to clean, put on the apron on. I know it looks real cute, were the words that were said. I know the apron looks real cute, and you got to go cook, and maybe she's on her phone, but you still have to sacrifice and you have to do it. And I'm sitting here being like, love your wives as you love your own body. I don't disagree with that. Great. Yes, absolutely do that. Yes, sacrifice for us. I want you, if you're going to sacrifice anything, sacrifice your male privilege. If you're going to sacrifice, if you're going to love me like you love your own body, care about the violence that is happening to me. What are you doing to stop the violence that is happening to my body? What are you doing to make sure that your boys aren't killing us in the streets? We just want to walk home safe at night.
Mm.
What are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want you to, this pastor was saying, like, make sure that she gets a glass of water, like feed her, nourish her, take care of her. I can get my own damn glass of water. Thank you very much. Tell your boys to stop killing me.
Mm.
That's
Yeah.
what I need right now. You want to step up and you want to love me as you love your own body? Step up. We said,
Yeah.
oh, this is what Jesus did. Jesus sacrificed. Jesus gave of his own body. Yes. Like, step up then. Jesus did give of his own body. Put your body in between me and the oppressor.
Mm.
Put your body in between me and the oppressor, because I just want to get home at the end of the night.
Yeah.
I just want to walk through a parkade and not have to have my keys in my fingers like Wolverine. I want to just not have to carry pepper spray. I just want to not have to have my friend on FaceTime to make sure that I survive to get home to sleep in my own bed at night. This is the culture that we're talking about. Women are just trying to live. That's it.
So, what about purity culture
Yeah.
had these women lose their lives in Atlanta?
Yeah. And so, okay, so as an embodiment coach, the majority of the people that I work with, not everybody, I work with people from all different backgrounds. And a lot of the people that I work with are not from the faith community at all. They have no religious affiliation. But the majority of the people that I work with are actually working to dismantle purity culture and come back into their own bodies in a way that is alignment with their values, the way that is healing from a religious trauma. And what I see all the time is this shame cycle that people get stuck in, this swirling shame cycle because of the messages that they have absorbed because of purity culture. We were taught total abstinence only education most of the time, those of us in this culture, in this community.
Mm-hmm.
If you got any appropriate comprehensive sex education, like amazing, I'm so glad. But most of us were just taught sex is reserved for marriage and heterosexual marriage as well. And that was pretty much it. Like, don't masturbate, don't look at pornography, don't even look at another woman. Do you remember the book from the like early 2000s of Every Man's Battle?
Ugh,
Remember that book?
yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I remember
yes.
reading it, reading the young man's version, reading the workbook, because ironically, like, I wanted to talk about sex because it is a part of who I am as a human being. I got zero access. So the only books that I got access that I was able to talk about sex and sexuality were these deeply purity culture books. And I remember in like the first chapter or the intro chapter, like the opening sequence of the book, they're talking about driving down the road. Do you remember this? And there's this woman who is jogging. She's just out for a run. She
Oh
just
no,
wants to
I'm
do.
scared.
Is this triggering anything in you?
Yes,
Do you
what?
remember it now?
No, I don't. I'm scared.
So, right? Your body is already like trauma.
I'm like, is she jogging at night? Oh my God.
It wasn't at night. She was just jogging, just jogging down the street. And he was so overcome with lust at her body because she was just driving down the street. He learned this strategy of bouncing his eyes. And so the author then teaches everyone who's reading it to learn how to, when they see a woman, to bounce their eyes so that they don't look at her, so they then don't lust after her. And I get it in the sense that I'm like, at least you're sort of taking responsibility, because we've been saying this whole time that like purity culture will often say that, you know, cover up your shoulders, because men will then like be overcome with lust because the clavicle is just so incredibly sexy that you will be compulsively needing to rape this woman because her shoulder is so goddamn sexy that you will be unable to withhold your desires, and you will end up raping her as a result. So rather than blaming these women for the temptation that they just could not avoid, at least this one book was saying that we need to bounce our eyes away from these women, sort of. But the
A
problem,
more mellow than pluck your eyes out, which is
it's a
what
more
Jesus
mellow,
said.
yeah. Which, what I think the heart of it, like, again, you have to read everything in the Bible with context. Like, Jesus is saying, like, pluck the sin out of your own body, like dismantle the same conversation that we're having, where we're saying, what are the things that need to be dismantled
Mm,
within you?
love
That's what
that.
Jesus is saying about pluck this out of your eyes. Dismantle the
Yes.
misogyny out of you. Dismantle the sexual objectification out of you. Cut it out of you. Do internal surgery. Get that out of you, because that is a cancer that is going to destroy you and everybody else around you. But this isn't what this book was saying. This book was saying, bounce your eyes. Don't look at her. So we're going to render women utterly invisible. We're just not going to include them. And this is one thing that I see within, you know, for me being in the Baptist church, this is something that I saw all the time, because I'm a former Miss Canada. After I became Miss Canada and I did a lot of speaking in churches, I did the preaching circuit, I did the conferences, I spoke pretty much as far as you can go. I rose as high as you can go as a woman speaker in the church, as an Asian woman speaker as well in the church. But I hit this glass ceiling because women weren't allowed to preach any further. Right? And so we
Mm.
have this whole idea, women were not brought to the table. The amount of times that I would look at a conference and I'd see all white men as the conference speakers. And I'd sit there and being like, it doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be me. But where are the women? Where are the people of color? There's no people of color speaking at any of your breakout sessions, speaking on any of your platforms, speaking at any of your main stage events. None of them. You don't have a single person from a different ethnic group that can teach you about this. And like, look, the amount of times that I get so much depth and different perspective when I listen to an Indigenous preacher preach about Jesus, an Indigenous man.
Mm.
What can a transgender person teach us about our God who transcends gender in a way that only a transgender person can?
Mm.
What can a woman teach us about Jesus's body being poured out, being bled out for us, poured out for us, this sacrifice? Like, this is my body broken and poured out for you. You and I are both mothers. My body knows what it's like to be broken and poured out. My womb knows what it's like to be broken and poured out so that humanity can exist every single month. There is so much richness and beauty that we are missing when we're only listening to one voice. And I see this problem in the church, and this is this culture that then breeds the racism, the misogyny. It's this Christian supremacy. It's this white supremacy. It's this white nationalism, which interestingly, I've heard people now stepping away from white supremacy. They don't want to own white supremacy, but people will proudly say, no, I'm a white nationalist. And you're like, really? Okay. Like, we don't see a problem with that. We
That's
don't
like The
see a problem with
Office.
that.
Yeah, the picture, the meme from The Office where it's like, what's the difference between these two pictures? Like,
Like,
it's
it's
the
the same
same,
picture.
same thing. White, yeah, Christian nationalism is racism,
Right.
is,
And
yeah.
how do we get that, right? We only have our leaders looking a certain way and speaking from one perspective. And if you do have any, like most of our churches are like white churches, they're still very segregated in our churches. There's white churches, there's black churches, there's Asian churches. And if you have any like cross-cultural interaction, a lot of the time it's because you're going to another country to like build wells, build homes. A bunch of youth group kids who are 15 years old think that they're completely qualified to build homes for people in a third world country that is third world because of colonization,
I was one
right?
of those kids. Yep.
Right. And
Yeah.
so we need to have these conversations of these conversations in the intersections of how does this happen? How does it happen that a good Christian boy who is the son of a Baptist pastor walk into a massage parlor and open fire on a bunch of women, open fire, which and witnesses allegedly say that as he opened fire, he said he wanted to kill all Asians. And he opens fire on these human lives because, according to the police report, he saw them as a temptation that he wanted to eliminate. Because
Mm-hmm.
he has grown up with a superiority complex because he's only listened to white leaders, and he has been told his whole life that sex is bad, sexuality is bad, except within this one certain context. And in any other capacity, you need to shut it down. And then you start to have this like shameful, self-loathing cycle that you're pulling yourself into. He himself, the shooter, the murderer, apparently had frequented these businesses. So the shame cycle is even deeper because he has done these things that we treat within the church, that like these sexual sins are way, way, way up here. Like we treat them as way high on this like apparent sin hierarchy scale, which doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's wanting that to stop. He just wants it to stop. But we see women as disposable. We've been taught to see them as invisible. And he thought it was more righteous to kill them in order to save his and reclaim his purity than face the misogyny and the racism and the harm that purity culture does in the first place. He thought it was more righteous and holy to eliminate the temptation for his sin.
Let me ask you, I don't know if you've done research on this very much, but the thing that's going to piss me off that I'm waiting to see is for every church to then double down and say this is a pornography problem and this is a sex addiction problem.
That's exactly what I'm already starting to hear.
Right. So I did a poll on God is Gray, and I just asked people if they've seen the rampant overuse of this completely like false diagnosis based in nothing, of men having sexual addiction or porn addiction in church. And it ended up being like 97% or of people said yes. And I know from my experience that the reason is because it's more like compulsory behavior, because everything is a sin. So when I talk to someone who says they suffer from, quote, porn addiction, you'll find out it's actually their compulsive desire to look at porn, and then they'll look at it once a month or once a week. And it's like, that is not a porn addiction. So could you explain from your perspective why and how this whole narrative is going to be hijacked away from misogyny and toxic church culture and into blaming again the sex industry, putting it back again on women and people of color for his murder of them?
His murder of them. Yeah, because it's our fault that we get murdered.
Yes.
Makes a lot of sense, right? And so so here's some context for yourself and your listeners. I'm currently studying at the Institute for the Study of Somatic Sex Education, which is amazing and so fantastic. It's like whole person sex education, and I love it so much. It's
I
very
want to
trauma
go.
informed, it's very embodied, it's fantastic. Sex addiction from a clinical standpoint does not exist. People have tried to get it put in as a clinical disorder. It gets thrown out every single time because it doesn't exist. Maybe you're just into something that other people aren't into, and if it's done ethically, and ethically means with consent, so that it's not coerced consent, so that you have the freedom to say no, that it's ethical, right? That's fine. People are into what they're into. That people have kinks and they have fetishes, and if it's not doing harm and it's in a consensual way that is ethical, it's fine. And people have varying degrees of libido, and usually if you're looking at from the clinical research, usually that's what they mean when they're saying, oh, this person is a sex addict, is they just have a very high libido, which is fine. And this, to me, as somebody who is a sex positive Christian, I'm sitting here looking at this saying, this is why we need comprehensive sex education that is fact-based, that is inclusive, that is empowering, and that is accessible for people, because people are sitting here over here being like, oh, I'm such a terrible human being. I'm twisted and I'm dark. And they have these like self-loathings. Okay, so you're kinky. That's fine. Do it in an ethical way. I'm kinky too. I'm just ethical about it, right? Like, that's fine. Integrate these things about yourself. This is why we need this accessible education for people. This is why we need to look at the intersections of spirituality and sexuality and allow you to come back home to your body in a way that dispels shame, in a way that embraces liberation and the wholeness of your humanity. And I really think that, like, where purity culture has gone wrong, and where I fear that people are going to double down on this in the church, is they are going to double down into purity culture. They are going to see like sex and sexuality as bad, rather than saying, like, look, this is a part of who you are. And I'm so convinced that this is a part of who we are because we look at our own anatomy. The clitoris exists.
Yep.
If the clitoris exists for no other purpose but pleasure, God thought that pleasure was a good idea.
Amen.
Right? And if women were like one of the last things, the last thing that we believe according to the creation story, if Eve was the last thing that God created, she is like the climax of creation.
Oh, I love
She is the
that.
climax of creation, and she was not complete without the clitoris. Right? And so this is a good thing. This is an important thing. But as with all things, ethics matter. And this is what I see when we talk about fleeing from sexual immorality. I've done research. I've been studying theology from an academic perspective for a decade. And I've looked into this, like, what are we actually saying when we're talking about sexual immorality? We're not saying that sex outside of marriage is sexual immorality. We're not saying that. When we look at the scriptures, every time, like, it doesn't very clearly, quite honestly, define what sexual immorality is, but it does list these certain things that often come right after they say sexual immorality. They say incense, they say bestiality, they say pedophilia, they say gang rape, things like that. And so I'm looking at all these and I'm looking at, where's the common thread here? The common thread is that it's a violation of consent. That is sexual immorality. It is a violation of consent. It is a dehumanization of that person's inherent humanity. That is what sexual immorality is. And that's the conversation that I deeply wish our churches were having. Because if we were having that conversation, our culture would be completely different within the church. But we're not having that conversation because it doesn't fit with the dominant political narrative the churches prescribe to. And in order to do that, we have to look at the fact that, like, there is a political agenda within the church. There is a reason for power and control, because we're trying kind of funnel people into one dominant theology for the most of the time. Of course, there's variations in theology. That's how we've come up with so many different denominations, because everything is an interpretation of scripture, right? But if it doesn't fit with that interpretation of scripture that these churches hold, they're not going to explore these things. And it's devastatingly harmful when we don't. Because sexual immorality, and I'll say it again for everyone in the audience, because I need you to hear this. Sexual immorality does not just mean sex outside of marriage. Sexual immorality means anything that violates a person's humanity, that violates their consent, that sees them not as someone that is made in the image of God, but strips them of their imago Dei and turns them into a sex object or something for you to just dominate, control, get profit or pleasure from. Anything that strips them from their humanity, that is sexual immorality.
And that includes animals too, which is pretty mind-blowing.
Right.
I don't think animals should be dismissed as non-spiritual beings, as they have been forever.
Right. Yeah. Bestiality, it's included in that. Pedophilia, it's included in that. Right. And so, yeah, it's deeply frustrating to me when the answer just seems so incredibly clear.
I know.
And this is who I know God to be. This is who I know Jesus. More importantly, if Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith, if not, Christianity does not have any other pillars except for Jesus. You take Jesus away, what are we doing? What are we even doing here? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing here? Right? And I see the way that Jesus lived out his life on earth. And it was always looking at the dignity and the humanity of other people and bringing people who had been pushed aside by the political agenda back into the fold, pushed aside by religious people who were following the rules, good Christian people. Not actually, Christians didn't exist at Jesus' time, but you know what I mean, right? The equivalent of the first century Palestinian equivalent of good Christian people that were pushing everybody else to the margins. So this is why this is a really hard conversation for us in the church to have, but we have to look at ourselves. We have to look at the way that we have at best been complicit in racism, misogyny, purity culture, and the dehumanization of other people. And at worst, the way that we have upheld and perpetuated these things. And it's a hard conversation to have with ourselves, but we must.
Amen. Yes.
Otherwise, what are we doing?
Exactly. What are we doing? Might as well. Let's save some lives.
Right?
I am really, really curious to hear about your experience with sex workers as well, because now this brings us to another intersection that you are very familiar with. And I obviously have a very nuanced perspective of it because, again, of ethics and consent, and pornography for that reason is very, very tricky for me because we don't always know why people are in that situation, if they want to be there, what has led them there. So it gets very, very complicated. And then, of course, this overarching theme of the majority of mainstream porn, which is violent, aggressive, not at all pleasure-based for a woman. Even the porn that I've seen, the angle that the dude is going in, I know for a fact doesn't even feel good. And I'm just like, and piggybacking off of that idea too, Cardi B just posted on her page this like Christian YouTuber who's like crying because her son might be exposed to WAP. And how are we going to teach our children? And I'm like, the answer is so obvious. It's so hard to not bang my head against a wall. What you need to do is advocate for comprehensive sex ed. The least of your son's problems is going to be exposed from a woman who is advocating for female pleasure. That is the least of your son's problems. As a matter of fact, that's a good problem to have.
Yeah. But the fact that, the science actually shows that women are often have higher libidos than men. Right? If you read Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, like this is revolutionary to a lot of people.
And Sunday brunches with my friends show the same statistics.
Right. Likewise. Girls' nights. You would be
always
surprised.
Like, why won't my boyfriend sleep with me? I need it. We're just like, okay, yeah.
Right? Right. And again, this flies in the face of what we had said before about like men are just like raging, like can't control their sexuality and their sex drives. And yet, you know, I'm a bisexual, demisexual, sapiosexual, polyamorous Christian woman.
Ooh.
And I know, I know, right? All the intersections again. Um, and like I know so many men who are demisexual who are like, I need to have an emotional connection before somebody before I feel any kind of sexual arousal. People are just wired differently.
And I'm
They're
the
just,
opposite.
there you go,
I'm like,
right?
you're hot. Let's go.
There
Not
you go.
nowadays, but
And this is why we need comprehensive sex education, because people are wired differently,
mm-hmm. I
right?
know.
And so to back to your question, within the context of you know, sex work and how that intersects with sexual exploitation, how that intersects with racism and misogyny and male violence and all of these things, we have to have a nuanced conversation. So I worked 10 years, like I mentioned, in ending sexual exploitation, in ending gender-based violence. I worked all across Southeast Asia. I did undercover investigations into Thailand and Cambodia. We went undercover into brothels for a while. I sat with women in aftercare homes. I worked in parliament, so I looked at it from a legislative perspective. I was the provincial director for a nonprofit. So I've looked at it from all these different angles. And what I find as the common threads is there is a percentage of people who are there by choice. That cannot be excluded from the conversation.
Yeah.
At the same time, when we talk about the concept of choice, we do have to talk about all the other factors, right? We do have to talk about the prevalence of racism and sexism. We have to talk about the history of colonization. Like here in Canada, Indigenous women have been going missing and murdered at an alarming rate. And it's the same in the United States. Like the United Nations has asked Canada to address the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls on multiple occasions. And a lot of these women end up being missing and murdered because of the sexual violence and the sexual exploitation, the way that Indigenous women are overrepresented in human trafficking statistics. So we have to talk about these things at the same time. Yes, there are people there by choice, and yet there are also absolutely people there who are not by their choice. And even choice can be complicated. Like, are you there because the choice, and I saw this a lot in Asia, I do see this here as well, but are you there because the choice is between not providing for your children and then just putting a brave face on and smiling when you are there with a client that you maybe wouldn't have actually chosen for yourself, but you have to do it because you have bills to pay and you have children to provide for and you're trying to be a good mother, right? Is that truly consent? Is that truly a choice? Or maybe as a society, we need to address the fact of like, why can't single mothers provide for their children? Why don't we have a living, viable working wage? Why do we not have safe and affordable housing? Why do we not have healthcare? Why is it so damn hard to get education? Like, can we talk about these? Can we talk about the gender pay gap? Are we talking about racism? Are we talking about fetishization of Asian women? Are we talking about the way that men withhold promotions for women unless they sleep with them? Are we talking about the way that like, oh, it's all who you know? And so if you want to break the glass ceiling, it's so much easier to be an underqualified man than maybe a woman who's overqualified for a role, but is just getting passed up because she didn't go golfing with the boys on the weekend? Right? So like, are we having those conversations? Because those are all absolutely contributing factors here.
I'm in love with you. Preach. And I really quickly wanted to address too, I've heard the wage gap argument of like, well, that's because women are choosing jobs that get, have less pay. And I'm just like, yes, but even why is that? Why are these jobs undervalued in society?
Absolutely. Why are female dominated industries making less than male dominated industries?
And even in coronavirus as well, like people are acting like these entry-level jobs, these people, they've been called entry-level jobs. And it's like, no, let's just call them jobs because that is what people need to do to earn a living.
Right.
And they should be respected as such. But of course, the legislation didn't pass to pay them a living wage. So here we are.
Well, and what I think is interesting as you're adding this layer of coronavirus in, when we're talking about these like gender imbalances as well too, the people who are essential a lot of the time were workers who are in the intersections of race and social class and gender, and definitely not CEOs and professionals who work in workplaces that are able to just like work from home over Zoom. A lot of times they have to subject themselves to potential danger from this virus that a year ago we knew nothing about, but they had to keep going without healthcare. I mean, I do live in Canada, so we healthcare is a little bit more accessible than us.
I know you guys are like
right?
a utopia in my opinion.
Right? Come on over, girl. When the border opens up again, you let
Send me
know.
someone to marry. I'll do it. I'm ready for the citizenship.
Right? But this is still a problem everywhere. And then even the fact, like, I worked for a while with this organization called Eltrage that is working to advance women in the workplace. And when we met with major banks and corporations and credit unions, they were saying most of the time that the problem wasn't finding incredible qualified female candidates. They could find that because their women have so much that they have to bring to the table. The problem was retaining incredible female talent, because if somebody in the family got sick at home, she would be the one who was expected to go home and take care of that sick child. She was the one who was expected to, and I mean like chronic illness. I'm not meaning just like, oh, the kids got called home from school, because although still moms are usually the ones who are called for that. But I'm meaning like so much so that she has to end her career that she was doing, that she was excelling at, and that they needed her for, because great grandmother is now needing to be taken care of at home every day because the child is sick and has cerebral palsy and needs a family member to care for them all the time. Right. And so when I was sitting in these meetings, in these board meetings, with banks and corporations, and they were sitting here saying like, no, we can find qualified women candidates. That's not a problem. The problem is actually keeping them, because they get midway into their career and something happens domestically at home and they get pulled out because women are still not equal at home. And a lot of these ideas come from people within the church who still view men as the head of the home. Oh, yeah. Like there was a conversation in a Christian feminist Facebook group that I was listening in on recently. And she was talking about this idea of being unequally yoked. And she was like, can I date? Like I've had this relationship for 4 months now with my non-Christian boyfriend. It is the healthiest, most respectful, like best communicative relationship I've ever been in. But I'm still feeling this guilt from purity culture saying that like I'll be unequally yoked with him. And I told her, like, I decided to comment on it. And I said, like, from my own personal perspective, and take it with a grain of salt, this is my lived experience. My perspective might be different than yours, but what I have found from my experience is that I've never been more disrespected than when I dated a Christian man.
Tell me why.
That did not treat me as an equal. That did not understand the way that he perpetuated sexual violence, that he came to me and coerced me as like, when I said, no, I'm not feeling it, they would keep pushing it until I was like, okay, fine, I'll sleep with you. Or okay, fine, I'll do this with you, whatever, just to get you off my back, because you're not listening when I'm saying no. Because in the church, you've been taught that you were entitled to it and that we just have to take one for the team, or because maybe with every rom-com that you've ever watched, the man is pursuing, air quotes, the woman, and she is saying no, she's not interested, and you just won't take no for an answer, and you think that's charming and cute, right? And so we perpetuated these ideas. I've never felt more unsafe than with Christian men most of the time. And then when I date non-Christian men, surprisingly, they understand ethics, they understand consent, they know how to see me as a whole person.
Yeah.
Whereas people within the church don't. Because what we see for representation within women in the church is that men preach on pulpits on Sunday morning, and they serve by serving communion and these leadership roles, and women serve by serving coffee and tea.
Mm-hmm. And I'll keep calling out Lisa Bevere until she finally freaking addresses this. But she recently put out an purity ebook, and I reference it in my book, On Her Knees, because it's worthy. It's like kind of just the most recent perpetuation in a mainstream way that I've seen this from a woman who you would think would be our advocate, but this is the opposite. I don't know the exact quote, but it is essentially, why would a man want to know more thoroughly what he's already known too quickly? This is a mother of X number of sons. Yes. She has sons. So I'm like, I wonder what your sons are out there up to, because do you not hear what you are saying? You are telling them women are less valuable if they're willing to be sexually available to your sons, to the men in the congregation. You're telling women, if you are sexually valuable or available, you are less valuable inherently. And then she talks about being less complete. You are not complete when you've lost pieces of yourself. You all listen. This is real. This is recent.
It's real.
This
I
is like a
know.
year ago post.
I know.
And it
I
keeps
know.
going over and over. And also, too, how many women's blogs have I read in Christian circles where it's like, if you are postpartum, if your body is healing and you can't be available for your husband's needs, which you're required to give him from Ephesians 5:22, then a blowjob is a good thing. Why don't you do an HJ instead? It's like, bitch, why don't you take a nap and sit down because you just had a baby? And why don't you tell this man he doesn't have quote needs? He can control himself. And also pair that with not allowed to masturbate. So
I was just going to say, and there's nothing wrong with self-pleasure. And there's nothing wrong with toys. Like, do you want me to go buy you a pocket pussy? Because I happily will. I've got 3 drawers in my chest of sex toys for me. And I have zero shame about it because God made my clitoris. And it is a good thing. And I have gotten to know my body more by self-pleasure so that I can then advocate for myself more and say, this is what I like, this is what I don't like. And guess what? That brings more unity and intimacy and connection with my partners.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is what we're preaching and saying that sex is for.
Right.
But we're not giving people the tools to be able to actually meet somebody else in that intimacy, right? Because we're not seeing one another. This goes back to the same problem from a very extreme point of what happened in Atlanta. We're not seeing people as whole people. And that's the problem here.
Exactly. So let's now address the racist element of it, because you and I just both went on this raging tangent of purity culture and what is happening right now, 2021, it's Sunday. I'm sure it's happening in thousands of churches right frickin' now. Like the pastor that you referenced earlier, that was Ephesians 5:22. This is what the hell we're talking about.
They're preaching about this morning.
Yeah. So this kid, I don't know anything about him, but presumably not allowed to touch himself. I mean, know the Baptist tradition. I'm evangelical. They're very akin. Not allowed to touch himself. Sees any view of pornography as, quote, addiction. Sees his libido as original sin. Is chastising himself constantly. Can't help the temptation of going to these massage parlors. So now, of course, you have what I referenced earlier in the conversation, where we see when we cross-checked men who had Yelp reviews for these massage parlors that had racist sentiments in them explicitly, like, I don't want a black girl because she was too rough on me. You need an Asian girl because they're softer. They know how to do this better. And then those same men were saying, I love this church on a different Yelp page. I'm a good Christian man. So this is what we're talking about. But this is now the element of racism, which I cannot speak to. I obviously have lived experiences too. Like, how often in my white ignorance have we sat around and been like, has anyone ever been with a black guy? Has everyone ever fucked an Asian dude? And we have that kind of conversation. Again, going to show, as much as we might want to live in a post-racial society, we do not. So speak to me from your perspective on that.
Well, the first thing I'd say is you do have a voice to speak into this conversation, but it's different than mine. Your voice is to call out other people from your community and say, this shit's not okay.
Yeah.
Because it's exhausting when we have to do that all day long. And we're being dismissed from the beginning because people don't see us as fully human. Right? And so maybe they'll listen to you in a way that they won't listen to me. And that is another takeaway that I really would love. I'm going to say it again and I'm going to highlight it because I would love all of your listeners to really take this to heart. Speak up when you're seeing these things. If you're seeing somebody aggressively come towards, and even if it's a microaggression, if you're seeing harm being perpetuated on a person of color in front of you, in your workplace, in Walmart, at the grocery store, to the barista, or even in the comment section online, step in and call them out. Call out your own community. That's what it means to be a good Christian person. That's what it means to be a nice person. Don't give me this nice guy entitlement because I gave her a couple compliments and now I'm entitled to sex. Be a nice guy because you care whether we live or die and whether we get home at night. Be a
Mm-hmm.
nice guy who stands in between us and the oppressor, not the nice guy who treats us like a vending machine that says, I gave her 3 compliments and I called her beautiful. Now give me a blowjob and let's have sex at the end of our date. That's not a nice guy. That's
Yeah.
just masquerading misogyny again,
And
right? So,
that's the sermons I hear so many times too. Men,
right.
why don't you do the dishes? And then
Yes,
she'll have sex with you.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I just had to say that. So going back into the conversation of racism and how this intersects with people that are in the church, I'm gonna bring it back again to when I was working in Southeast Asia, and when I worked in this issue here across Canada and the United States as well, because I worked all across North America on this. And when we saw, especially, is very over the top when we were in Southeast Asia, because men just have the audacity to think that their white skin, their passport, and their full wallet of cash allows them absolute impunity. And so here I would find that, like, if a man is being intimidating and if he's catcalling or if he's doing something that is racist or misogynist, if I look him in the eye long enough, he'll get uncomfortable and he'll walk away or he will look away. But in Southeast Asia, if I were to look a white man in the eyes, he would not back down. And the experience that I felt as I'm biracial, but as an Asian woman in these places where we wired me up with cameras and I was sent in as the bait when we worked undercover. So
Wow.
I was like, the way that these men who come from our good Christian churches, who spend their yearly vacation in Southeast Asia because they feel like they do not get the respect from American women at home. So they go to places like Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Laos, Malaysia. They go to my ancestral countries, and they buy women, they abuse women, and they say that they do that there because Asian women have this stereotype and fetishization of being submissive, of being sweet, of being demure, of being eager to please, and of being hypersexualized with beautiful, small, petite Asian bodies and tight little pussies, tight little vaginas, because that is the stereotype. They go there for that because they think that women in America are too opinionated, too loud, and they don't respect them because we are calling them on the consequences of their racist and misogynist behavior, because women here are calling them out on their actions. So they go somewhere else in order to perpetuate this harm, where their dollar and their white privilege of their passports allows them to buy these women, to purchase their bodies, and to rape them for profit. I know that it sounds incredibly vulgar to put it in those terms, but let's not sugarcoat it. That's exactly what it is. We watched men just drape their arms possessively over these Asian women, sometimes twice their age or twice their size. And these women have no other option but to smile and just take the abuse. And men are doing that there, and men are doing that here as well too, because they think that they can get away with it. And most of the time, because of the culture that we're raised in, they can. That's why they have no fear doing their Yelp review to the massage parlor, objectifying a woman's body, and also reviewing a church down the road. They have no problem putting their full face and their full name on that, because this is the culture that we live in. And there's no consequences for them. And this is why we need to all be part of changing this narrative.
Yeah. Can you explain to me your choice to use the word rape there? Because if they're paying for the service, why are
Right.
we using the word rape?
Because it's not consensual.
Because it's like a forced scenario.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And again, there are sometimes women who are in working in sex work by choice, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking
Yeah.
about the ones who have the choice. I'm not talking about the ones who can walk away if they've been raped, if they've suffered violence. I'm not talking about the ones who have relationships with their clients, who get to choose their clients. I'm talking about the ones who don't have a choice. And even if people are there by choice, I still don't want them to be raped. I still don't want them to suffer violence. I still don't want them to deal with male violence in any capacity. So
Yeah.
I still want to stand up for them because their lives have just as much value.
Of course. And the only reason I asked for that clarification is it's because it does seem to be, I know how to, but in conversation with others, it seems like a hard line to draw, to be like, when is sex work ethical? So you're using the word rape in this scenario, but then we're also advocating for people to have the choice to become sex workers. So how do you, I mean, obviously we've talked about ethics and everything, but do you have anything else to add as far as a male person who maybe this isn't his tradition, this is something that he's done, maybe he has been attending a lot of these massage parlors. I know men in my life who have done this or who actually have a habit of it. And in some ways it seems like this seemingly harmless thing. It's like a part of the massage, and it doesn't feel like an abusive exchange in any way. So how can someone clarify when they're doing something ethical or not? Because I don't want people to fall into greater shame spirals or vilify sex work in any way further.
Totally. And I think if you understand consent truly, it's quite simple, honestly. And this is why we need comprehensive sex-based education. Comprehensive education to understand consent. People might sit there and say, oh, well, she said yes. Did she say yes because you wouldn't stop asking for it? Did she say yes just because she didn't say no? Did she say yes because she had to survive another day? Because she had no other options? Did she say yes because she was in a place that she didn't feel safe enough emotionally or physically to say no? Did she say yes, but we have plays of classism, of racism, of like what is the context of this? Is she a small, young Asian woman and you are a white, big, privileged man? Is your body 3 times the size of her and she doesn't feel safe enough to say no? Because that's not consent then. Right? And this is the same in any context. This is the same in your bedroom. This is the same in sex work and anything else. Consent is the same across the board, right? It's not ethical unless you talk about all these layers.
Yeah. Something I also brought up in my posting about these murders in Atlanta was that I was sexually assaulted, which is something that I didn't even recognize as real until the Me Too movement, because I hadn't verbalized a no, which is why I'm so obsessed and in love with the term enthusiastic consent.
Yes.
But also I wrote about it in my book. And when I was reliving the experience, which was terrible, I was like, if he knew the practice of embodiment, if he knew how to look someone in the eye, if he didn't, this was someone who was privileged with wealth, who had bought me a hotel and like treated me on a vacation and let himself into my room because he obviously felt that he was privileged and had a right to my body because he paid for these things.
The room, yes.
Even though I explicitly had said beforehand that that was never going to be a part of the arrangement. And this, I mean, I have a bazillion stories just living in my body in LA in these situations. Anyway, I look back at that and I'm just like, don't pretend you don't know when a woman doesn't want this. Don't pretend that you're a white man in Cambodia with your arms slung over a 15-year-old girl and pretend you're doing something ethical. What is her body saying to you? What is her body language? Is she in pleasure? Is she in joy? Stop playing dumb. You are not dumb. You're not dumb.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is one of the big things that I work with my clients as an embodiment coach a lot of the time is coming back into our bodies, into relationship with our bodies, learning to listen to our bodies. And so what I mean by that, to walk you through that process, is think about this moment when you met someone or something and you just like knew this was for you. This was going to be good for you. Like, this is somebody that, like, maybe this is somebody who I could love. Like, maybe this could be the one. You know that feeling in your body when it's like every cell of your body is alive. You're like, this is good. Now contrast that feeling that you have, that you can feel right now in your body, that memory in your mind, in your body. Contrast that feeling with that feeling when something came towards you, something came across your desk, something came into your life, and you're like, logically, on paper, this is checking every box. This should be good. But there's just something unexplainable in your gut. You can feel it in your stomach. You feel it in every bit of your body. You can't put your finger on it, but your body is saying like, no, walk away. This is not for you. This is not right. This is not good. No. It might look amazing on paper. Everybody might be saying, this is an amazing opportunity, but you just can't even explain it. But there's something that's just not right. There's something off about it. Do you know that feeling?
Yes.
That's your body speaking to you and warning you. That's your body. Your body speaks to you. Your body speaks to you. And most of us spend all day long, especially people who are like very intellectual, very fact-based, very cerebral, will sit around and all of us, doesn't matter who you are, even if you're not a research nerd like you and I both are, we'll sit there and we exist up in our minds all day long.
Mm-hmm.
We're living in our heads all day long. We need to get out of our heads. We need to get into our body. And for those of us within the church, this is so incredibly important. I'm actually writing a book right now about embodiment, justice, and reclamation. And one of the things that I'm spending a lot of time exploring is the history of disembodiment in the church. You know, there's verses about Paul saying he pummels his body, right? There's a long history of monks who would whip their own bodies to try to get their fleshy desires out of who they are, to separate them from their humanity. And yet when we see the person of Jesus Christ, Jesus did not shy away from his humanity. He leaned in to his humanity. And so the very thesis of the work that I do and the book that I'm writing is that maybe your body is not the place that you have to shut down in order to meet God. Maybe your body is actually the altar where you meet God. Maybe your body is a place where you meet God and goodness. And maybe if the shooter knew this, he would not have gone and taken the lives of these other Asian women.
Beautiful. I completely agree. Do you have any final thoughts to leave us with?
I'm going to leave you with the same one that I started with. Be brave enough to sit in the discomfort. Be brave enough and humble enough, posture yourself with a posture of humility. I think this is why the Bible says, like, what does God just require of us? To act justly, to walk humbly, to love mercy. We sit here and we create this like hierarchy of rules, and it creates the web of the culture that we exist within, that is swirling all around us. The only thing that God asks us to do is love God and love others, to act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. So come to this conversation, and you have, if you've listened to this already, and you've listened to this conversation to the end of it. And thank you so much, deeply, from the bottom of my heart, for giving us the time to sit and listen to the fullness of this conversation that we've just had. And to do so with an open heart and mind, with a posture of humility, to see me in the fullness of my humanity, to see one another in the fullness of our humanity. That's where things change. That's what Jesus did when he would sit with people that everybody else in the world dismissed because of race, class, gender, sexuality, identity, all of these things. He sat with and saw us in the fullness of our humanity. He was willing to call out the things that did us harm. He flipped tables because people were being exploited. He flipped tables because people were being harmed. He had no problem looking us in the eye and calling us out when the crowd came to stone someone. We need to do the same. We need to be willing to have those hard conversations within the church, within North America, at how we have perpetuated racism, of how we have perpetuated misogyny, of how we have perpetuated classism, of how we have marginalized people, how we have bounced our eyes away from them so that we don't even see their humanity anymore, so that they are invisible to us, so that we've treated people as sex objects, and we have fetishized them, and we have used their bodies, their holy bodies, for our own personal profit, pleasure, or gain. There's a reckoning that needs to happen within the church. But I'm not saying we need to do that necessarily with a wrecking ball. I still have love for the people within the church because I take my faith seriously. I take what Jesus says seriously, but we do have a lot of dismantling to do. It is a whole reno job that needs to be done within the church. And we need to come that owning it. We need to come to that owning where we have done harm, not excusing it and doubling down in purity culture now and saying that is the problem. No, we are the problem. And until that happens, people are going to continue to die, and the church is going to continue to be accountable for it. And that is hard to hear, but it is the truth.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tara. I really appreciate you being here with us. How can everyone find you? I will link everything below, but just let us know.
Yeah, so you can find me across the board. My handle is at Miss Tara Teng, MISSTARATENG. You can find me through my website, taratang.com. I do offer one-on-one coaching if these are things that you're like, shit, I need to work through this, and I need support in a non-judgmental way. We never approach things with judgment. You might hear passion in my voice today because I care deeply about people's lives, but I'm not coming at it with judgment. I come at these things and I've uncovered all of these layers with curiosity and then with a passion to do something about it. And if you are hungry and desperate for change as well too, that's something that we can walk through together. We can walk through that together because it is only with kinship that we see each other through the fullness of our humanity and that we are able to bring change into one another's lives. And I truly believe that Jesus didn't just come here to save my life. He didn't just come here to save your life. I believe that Jesus is big enough to transform all of it, that Jesus came to transform every broken thing in the world. So let's actually live like we believe that.
Beautiful. I love it. Thank you all so much for being here. We love you so much. God bless.